Hey everyone. Today I'm joined by me, Brendan Dempsey, actually. Wanted to take an opportunity to throw some stuff into the conversation, largely in response to a lot of interesting developments happening in the broader sort of metamodern, liminal, and adjacent community scene, as it pertains to Christianity and conversions to Christianity. I most recently interviewed Jordan Hall, who recently converted, and we had a long conversation, really fascinating, talking about his conceptions of Christian theology, and got a lot of engagement, over 2,300 views in 48 hours. Clearly, this stuff is very alive for people, and as others have noted, it's sort of part of a broader trend going on in, again, this sort of general area of discourse. It's been called the God pivot recently by Conspirituality, and Jules Evans just wrote a piece about this as well, which I can link. But it basically is naming this phenomenon that we're seeing of figures like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Huberman and Aubrey Marcus, Joe Rogan, even Russell Brand, sort of espousing a sort of newfound religious Christian commitment in a kind of traditional flavor, a kind of conservative theological flavor. And this is also playing out, in more immediate spaces to kind of the metamodern conversation. Jonathan Pageau, of course, has been popular for a while now, and has had conversations with folks like John Vervaeke. He focuses a lot on sort of the traditional symbolic and more kind of conservative hermeneutic approach to Christian theology. Paul Vanderklay and this corner of the internet and that scene. And then overlapping with that, folks like Paul Anleitner, who is engaging with metamodernism and Christianity, but not just Christianity, also other forms of sort of monotheistic, well, just let's just say theistic traditions. I mean, you've got Zach Stein and Mark Gaffney, who are writing work that's deeply engaged with the with forms of traditional Judaism and that whole approach. Even Shia LaBeouf actually converted to Christianity recently, an early adopter of metamodern thought, perhaps. But all this kind of raises a big question for metamodern religion, I think, and particularly metamodern Christianity. And so that's kind of what I wanted to address, because when we look at what's going on and we look at these sorts of conversions experiences and the shift towards more conservative religion, as I would characterize it anyway, there is a question, right? Is this representative of a metamodern phenomenon, or is this something else? And how do we make sense of this in the way that it's playing out in these different discourse spaces? For me, metamodernism is really all about meaningfully toggling between multiple perspectives: the pre-modern, the modern, postmodern, and getting some kind of synergistic new thing that comes from that toggling. And when I look at a lot of what's going on, I'm not seeing actually a lot of the modern perspective. It seems to me that a lot of the kind of modern historical critical insights are kind of absent from a lot of this. And that was really why I thought I would do this, and felt like an interesting uh, aspect of the conversation that's been missing, that probably has been missing for a reason, and there probably aren't many people that can speak to some of this stuff in this scene, and so that's probably why I'm having to have myself on my own podcast, because that's just is a kind of blind spot, maybe to some degree, in the theological conversation. So I wanted to bring that into the mix. That was what I wanted to make this about. That if there is this sort of non-engagement with the modern historical critical insights, let's throw them into the conversation. And because if they're not, then I think that whatever we're seeing, however earnest and maybe even beneficial it might be for the folks involved, and maybe even culture more broadly, thinking of it as metamodern is problematic. And if we're seeing this as essentially a sort of readoption of older traditional forms of religion, then that doesn't strike me as something particularly progressive. And so, yeah, offering this into the space, and we'll see what comes from it. So all I really wanted to do here with this was to try to present a couple of what you could call interpretive lenses, which, well, in the history of kind of theology, it has been thought of in terms of what's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics has to do with interpretation. and how different reading communities make sense of texts, and what sorts of sense people draw from what sorts of ideas and sense people draw from, I guess in this case, scripture, right? But we could say the religious tradition more broadly. And in terms of the sort of hermeneutic positions, we can identify meaningfully, I think, two at least that I want to just explore in this conversation with myself. One is the traditional devotional, let's call it, and the other is the modern historical critical. And obviously, these are going to be oversimplifications. They're going to be, kind of any kind of typological system has to oversimplify a bit, but they do capture really meaningful differences that I think need to be considered and taken seriously. I have in a kind of personal, intimate relationship with both of these hermeneutic traditions, these different perspectives. I was raised in a traditional devotional framework. I grew up in a religious family, and had a very kind of devotional relationship with my faith. But I also studied biblical studies and classical civilizations in the ancient Near East, and Greek and Hebrew and all that, to gain insight into the history of, and the kind of the broader context for that faith, and in that process became intimately aware of that hermeneutic tradition as well. And that's another story, but at the very least, something I wanted to contextualize this with. So what I want to do here now in the next, little bit is just lay out these different lenses and see how they do or don't overlap with each other. I guess straight up, I'll just say a lot of the new engagements and these conversions that I see playing out in this space seem to be through the traditional devotional lens. And that has a certain flavor and a certain kind of set of presuppositions and orientations. It's its own perspective. And so I wanted to kind of describe my understanding of that perspective, but then I also wanted to describe what I'm not seeing, which is the historical critical hermeneutic lens. And then after laying these out, I think that we can then begin to consider what it might look like to do something in the vein of, say, metamodern theology, metamodern Christianity, which somehow, right, would have to grapple with this pre-modern traditional devotional lens and the modern lens. We'll leave out the postmodern for now, but that could be an interesting thing and needs to be an interesting thing that gets folded into the mix. So here goes. Here's my understanding of these lenses. Okay, so the traditional devotional lens in kind of Christian theology, let's say. Well, I'll do this both for sort of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then we'll look at the traditional devotional and historical critical. So, traditional devotional lens of the Old Testament. Well, the notion here is that the Old Testament, which is called the Hebrew Bible for Jews, was written by prophets through sort of a process of divine revelation. That it connects in a meaningful way to God, and this is sort of a message that God is communicating to the world through inspired prophets to write this down and share it with the world for the better, for their salvation ultimately. And in this story, God creates the world in 6 days, including humanity. But the understanding the interpretation that comes from the book of Genesis is that Satan, in the form of a snake in the garden, causes humanity to fall into sin through temptation. And so humanity is cast into a sort of state of degradation and depravity, and is sort of pushed out of the garden and has to go sort of scratch a living out of the ground. This begins the whole period called the patriarchal period. Well, there's a primeval history in which there's a flood and a Noah's Ark and all that, but we'll just name that. But still, the kind of revelatory history of humanity begins with the patriarchs, and you've got people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And there are stories in the book of Genesis that recount the various goings on of these patriarchs. Then you get basically the ancient, let's say, Israelites through Joseph going down into Egypt and eventually getting enslaved there in the stories. And so then there's the grand liberation of the Israelites through the person of Moses, and this colossal exodus out of Egypt thousands and thousands of enslaved captive Israelites are taken through the sea. Moses parts the sea, and they go through into the promised land. And then before they enter the promised land, they come to Mount Sinai. And there is where God makes his sort of covenant with humanity through Moses on Mount Sinai, and writes the Ten Commandments and gives Israel the law, essentially. From there, you get this group moving into the land, the promised land that God has given them, promised to them, and they take it over. There's a conquest of Canaan. Joshua rises up. He slays many, many Canaanites, and they basically take control over the promised land. After that, there's this sort of period of tribal rule, and then eventually the establishment of a monarchy under Saul. You get David and Solomon, who kind of are the earliest of these monarchs after the monarchy is transitioned over to David, and these represent these glory days, sometime around 1000 BC, when David builds this grand palace, or Solomon builds this grand palace and temple in Jerusalem, and it's a kind of heyday of the ancient Israelite monarchy. And then over the preceding centuries, the story is that the different reigning kings either are true to the covenant with God, or they break the covenant. They're either idolatrous, and most of them are, except for a few of the good ones who commit to a kind of radical monotheism. And basically, there's a series of prophets who, as things aren't going well, proclaim, doom unless there's repentance and this kind of turn to monotheistic faith in God. And then this doom finally comes. The Babylonians wind up destroying Israel, taking a bunch of them into exile, which is deemed the punishment for their idolatry. But God relents and is merciful and allows them to come back into their promised land. But when they do, there's this sort of sense of hope that there will be a return of the great glory days of old, and the Davidic kingship will return, which becomes a sort of latent messianic expectation, which will then take us out of the Old Testament and then into the New. That's basically, in sum, the story, you could say, of the traditional devotional interpretation of the Old Testament. Well, okay. What's the modern historical critical lens on any of this? Keeping in mind also that this interpretive lens gets sort of filtered through many, many centuries of tradition, right? And tradition means to hand down, like from one generation to the other. So a lot of the framing of this gets handed down in terms of ways of understanding the community and the identity and the importance of everything through the centuries. And when you get into the rise of modernity, in the 17th century and beyond, you start seeing this particular way change, and the rise of new ways of thinking based on new methods, and subjecting the texts and the history to the same kinds of procedures and methods that you would subject any text to, and using a lot of the skills, new developed skills around philology, basically the study of language and etymology and that sort of a thing, history, archaeology, textual criticism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. From the Renaissance into the early modern period, you get a rise of a new kind of biblical scholar, equipped with, incredible skills with the ancient languages and with a lot of this additional information. And this is sort of the rise of the modern historical critical method and the interpretive lens that it offers on to, let's say, in this case, the Old Testament. So using these methods, what do we get? And so what I'm going to say now is not controversial among historical critical scholars. It's sort of the more or less the consensus in this interpretive framework. And I'm not trying to make any bold claims and I'm also not going to try to use any specific lines of argumentation to rehash or rehearse all of the conclusions I'm about to state. But over the past 250, 300 years of this form of scholarship, what I'm about to say is sort of the consensus opinion on the Old Testament. First of all, it's believed that it was written by many people over hundreds of years, and that, for example, the Torah, the first five books of the Bible, or the Pentateuch, is a good example. It's a compilation of multiple sources, whereas the traditional devotional lens says that that was written by Moses, more or less in kind of a direct transmission with God. The historical critical method has revealed that there are actually multiple sources that have been interwoven with each other. Um, it's called the documentary hypothesis, and this was sort of the standard view. Still largely is, though. More recently, other more fragmentary approaches have also gained more adherence. But in any event, the emphasis is on its fragmentary and multiple strands rather than its singular coherent authorship, which it lacks. And this can be demonstrated very, very clearly and convincingly, I think, to show the different sources and how they interact. And then once you isolate them, you can actually see the specific sort of, let's say, values and perspectives actually of the strands themselves. So this new perspective on the Old Testament gives us a perspective into the various perspectives that were going on over the course of hundreds of years in ancient Israelite history, as people wrote things down and then compiled them together into a kind of growing narrative of national identity. This is called like JE, D, and P, the Yahwist, the Elohist, Deuteronomist, and priestly sources. But there are others, the Holiness Code, Covenant Code. There's basically a series of sources that were combined together. Now, this is actually very important when you go to read the Bible and you try to interpret it, because what does it mean if you've got two different sources that have been woven together and you're just going to read it through as though it's one story? What sense do we take from that story if we're not paying attention to the different sources? And here I think this is like a really important thing to add into the conversation, especially when you see folks like Jordan Peterson doing biblical interpretation seminars, and having conversations with bishops and folks like Pajot talking about what is this story about, what does it mean. They're basically working with the text from the traditional devotional angle, taking it as something that's a coherent whole and sort of analyzing it like that, and really looking very closely for trying to read out of the text moral insight and psychological insight, etc. That's very alien to what the picture that you get from the historical critical method. And I'll give you an example of that, which would be the Abraham story of sacrificing Isaac. That story is actually an interweaving of a couple of different strands, but it mostly comes from the E strand. And what's interesting about it is that the moment in which Abraham doesn't kill Isaac is actually a redactional kind of interpolation into the text. It's not in the original E source. If you just follow what's in the E source, Abraham goes up the mountain with Isaac. He comes back down by himself, and then Isaac isn't in the rest of the E source. So did Abraham actually sacrifice Isaac in the E source? That's a very different story than what we get in the final canonical version, in which there's been redaction, interpolation, and the mixing of sources. So then the theological implications you might draw from the significance of that is very significant. And if you're not paying attention to how the sources shift, you're going to draw very different kinds of conclusions based on thinking that this is the given history of the tradition. Countless other examples could be given: the plagues in Egypt, or what have you. Even the Genesis accounts of the creation of the world, there are actually two, one from P and one from J, and they tell very different accounts of the creation of the world. And the first one in Genesis 1, that's by P, the priestly source, and it's a particular vision of the divine and the creative act. In J, you get something much more anthropomorphic, and God creates Adam and Eve out of the dust and breathes into their nostrils, etc. Very different conceptions of the divine, and different conceptions of creation in a way that actually can't be fitted together without producing contradictions. Now, historically, in the traditional devotional approach, those have been ignored, those contradictions, or they've been explained in various ways in attempts to explain them away. Or, for example, in the story of Noah's Ark, the P source has 2 by 2 the animals go in, but the J source has 7. And these are just glaring contradictions in the text that need to be accounted for somehow, or just ignored. But yeah, if you try to account for them, then there needs to be some additional thing that goes into that interpretation. The modern historical critical lens gives us an interpretation that you can separate those sources out and you can see them on their own terms, and then you can make sense of them. The traditional devotional approach obviously approaches this very differently. So just to suggest some of the implications for some of this. Now, in addition, the historical critical lens brings to bear archaeology and, gosh, I mean, anthropology, ethnography, the whole litany of sort of social and natural sciences to on the topic of this material, let's say. And when we do that, and which is to say, when we bring to the Bible, in this case, the Old Testament, all this other scientific information, it produces a a result that creates its own forms of conflict, let's say, relative to the traditional devotional approach, which largely just focuses on the text and assumes that it is more or less recounting what happened. For example, in terms of archaeological evidence, there's no evidence for the patriarchs ever having existed, Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, etc., which isn't necessarily surprising. I mean, that's a very long time ago, but still, the only evidence that we have for any of that is from the Bible. What we have from the Bible seems to contradict the historical record. For example, there's talk of the domestication of camels, for example, which we know didn't happen until a certain point in history, but the time that these stories are set would have been before that. So that creates a kind of historical, what we would, from the historical critical lens, call an inaccuracy or an anachronism. But that's from that perspective. There's also no evidence, perhaps more surprisingly, for the captivity in Egypt or the Exodus, when you're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people moving out of Egypt and up into ancient Palestine. There's no historical or archaeological evidence of that that has been found. And so the account that is in the text differs from what else can be brought to bear from other scientific methods. What else? Another interesting component, for example, is that the covenant at Mount Sinai is actually a mixture of material. Most of it is quite late. So there's a conception in the traditional devotional hermeneutical stance that kind of ancient Israelite faith began as this monotheism that was sort of codified at Mount Sinai, and that is sort of the leitmotif that runs throughout all of ancient Israelite history. It's the standard by which the different kings are assessed, right? And it's the justification for the entire Babylonian captivity as punishment for that idolatry. But the story revealed by the historical critical method is very different. It paints a picture in which ancient Israelite religion was actually still polytheistic, and was much more like its other ancient Near Eastern neighbors than has tended to be assumed. So the relationship that gets framed in the Sinai material is a kind of retroactive reimagining of the theological relationship between God and man that gets developed later on and then gets sort of put back in time. So again, very profound implications for theological consideration, none of which is am I seeing in the conversation that I was talking about earlier. Furthermore, after Sinai, there's no archaeological evidence for a conquest of Canaan by the ancient Israelites in terms of looking at the ancient sites, looking for damage or destruction or fire burning marks, that sort of a thing. There's almost none of that. Some instances that might be interpreted that way. I think Jericho might, as some kind of a battle that happened there around that time that would have that could support that kind of a narrative. But on the whole, actually, when you look at this period in ancient Israelite archaeology, you don't see the signs of an invading force. What you actually see is the sort of slow propagation of different communities, sort of kind of assimilating maybe different tribes and this sort of a thing, but it's an internal diversification and a spread after the Bronze Age collapse. And so again, just when brought to bear on the biblical account from the traditional devotional lens, history gives a very a different account that is part of the modern historical critical lens. Um, so yeah, I guess finishing that thread up, a lot of the Old Testament um, from this lens can be read very compellingly as sort of retroactive storytelling. A lot of the texts are much later than they are believed to be in the traditional lens. The usual approach in the traditional lens is to take as a given that if a prophet, wrote a book, then they wrote all of it, and that's the time that they did that. For example, like Isaiah, right, was in the 8th century. So when they talk about the book of Isaiah, oh, Isaiah wrote the entirety of Isaiah. And so we can date Isaiah to the 8th century. Well, actually, when you look at the source material of Isaiah, you find multiple strands of the tradition that clearly mark different historical periods or epochs. That actually you're looking at a school of multiple hands over many, many years who have compiled things at different points in ancient Israelite history. So, for example, there's a Deutero Isaiah who was writing towards the close of the Babylonian captivity, and Trito Isaiah writing after that. And so these are actually not just three people, but three moments in history, probably three schools, and spanning a long period of time. And so we can't just simplistically or naively believe that the book of Isaiah was written by a person named Isaiah at such and such a time. And other texts that claim to be written by certain people are actually not. The book of Daniel, for example, is a very late work, even though it's set during the Babylonian period. We know through linguistic evidence, for example, the use of Aramaisms, that it dates to the Persian period, if not, well, I'm sorry, that it has influences from the Persian period and is sort of probably on the cusp of the Persian and the Greek. In fact, you can read the book of Daniel as a direct relationship to the historical things that were going on at that time, with Antiochus Epiphanes coming in and the Seleucid Empire taking over, and the religious tensions that ensued. And the last thing I guess I'll say here, which is of vital importance, is that that book, for example, the Daniel, is apocalyptic. What happens when the Israelites, I guess now called Jews, come back into the Promised Land after the return from exile? That Davidic kingship expectation that grows into a sort of messianism takes on an apocalyptic flavor. And by this point, they've been influenced by and had contact with Persian and Babylonian myth, and with Zoroastrianism, for example, and so you wind up getting increased dualism and a kind of radical cosmologization of theology, and this is also coincident with axial age developments that are leading thought more into the abstract, into the cosmic, and so you wind up getting this apocalyptic framing of reality, and the invention of Satan. Perhaps most importantly, Satan is actually not really a figure in the Bible until late, and where he does appear, there's a different conception of it if you go into the actual context of that period. Shaitan was the adversary in a prosecutorial sense, and so in the book of Job, for example, is not meant to be the great cosmic evil force, but is actually in God's holy retinue. Many books have been written about this, but it's a fascinating story. The point is that Satan can't really be retroactively read back into, say, the J text, where where a snake in the garden tempts Adam and Eve. To read that as Satan is a retroactive theological move that happens after Satan gets invented and then reread back into the Bible. And so this apocalyptic framework really takes off during this period and leads into the intertestamental period. And there's a flourishing apocalyptic literary output that happens. But because almost none of it was ever canonized, most people don't know about it. But in the pseudepigraphal writings, this is just one volume, but imagine two of these. There's a whole bunch of stuff that just never got canonized. Book of Enoch, the apocalypses of Adam and Eve and Abraham, etc. Many apocalyptic texts were written during this period. And most of them pseudepigraphic, meaning under the names of people that didn't write them. So the Apocalypse of Abraham was not written by Abraham. It was written, sometime in this intertestamental period before the first millennium AD, by someone claiming to be Abraham. And this tendency to write under a false name or pseudepigrapha was very common in the ancient world, and accounts for a lot of the literature in the Bible, which we'll come back to. So pause there to reflect on sort of the different vision provided by the historical critical lens on the Old Testament. I don't know if any of that is brought up in, say, Jordan Peterson's assessment of the Bible, or Jonathan Pageau's for that matter. Whenever I've sort of tuned into their explorations of the material, it tends to focus much more on the psychology and on the symbolism and on the morality of it, and again takes it sort of as presumes a coherent whole to the whole thing. For example, reading the story of Abraham and Isaac, kind of like Kierkegaard did, right, is this profound psychological drama that's unfolding, and all the reading, and I would say reading into all of the gaps in the text and how it doesn't say what Abraham is thinking and what is he feeling, what's he thinking. Most of that, I think, from a historical critical perspective, would have to be profoundly problematized when you get into the issues of genre, when you get into the issues of source criticism, etc. And actually, I mean, something I'm trying to bring to the conversation as well is when you get into the developmental angle for all this, because the psychologization that we do of the text as modern individuals is largely a retroactive reading of our internal subjective states into the inner worlds of people who lived, thousands of years ago in very different cultural contexts before modernity. And the degree to which that is a legitimate thing to do is a good question to ask. But one we can't ask if we don't consider the different lenses and the different perspectives of the pre-modern and the modern, and so forth. So moving on to the New Testament then, which is in many ways a lot more apropos of the recent conversions specifically to Christianity, and particularly important too. In my conversation with Jordan Hall, three things he raised as his sort of orienting conditions for his conversion that sort of were his reasonings behind the belief. One of them was a first-person phenomenological subjective framing. And as I said in the conversation, I could relate to that a lot and felt that was still very valid and workable. But the other two he named were scripture and history. And those are both things that the modern historical critical lens has things to say about. And the things that it has to say are very different from the traditional devotional lens. And a lot of the framing that Jordan offered for his conversion was a sort of justification via the traditional devotional interpretive lens. So here I would also like to introduce, to those who aren't familiar with it, but at the very least, emphasize into the conversation the historical critical approach as well, so that people have that in their mix, and then we can begin to toggle between pre-modern and modern. But let's lay it out first, what the traditional devotional lens looks like of the New Testament. Well, essentially, the life and works of Jesus of Nazareth are recounted in the four Gospels, written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, disciples of Jesus, so eyewitnesses to these events, and so, a good source, one would think. These Gospels recount Jesus as being descended from David, and hence the Messiah, who was foretold. Indeed, his birth was foretold. There was a star in the heavens, and the wise men came and saw it, the whole Christmas narrative. Jesus was born of a virgin who never had sex before, and was sort of a miraculous conception. And so clearly a very sacred, otherworldly sort of approach to what's happening here. Something very out of the ordinary, very supernatural, clearly marks the life of Jesus, and Jesus is no ordinary person. And in fact, he is the Son of God, come into the world to die for humanity's sins, those sins that got started back with Adam and Eve when they were tempted by Satan in the garden and humanity fell. Since that whole time, things have not been good and getting worse. And so in an act of loving kindness and mercy, God himself has sent his own son into the world to save humanity. And Jesus has this conception of himself as that Messiah who will be doing that saving act. And he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," etc. And so most of his ministry is going around telling people about himself, performing miracles, casting out demons, preaching the good news of this coming redemption, and telling people to repent. As he does this, he upsets the religious and political authorities and gets crucified. He gets capital punishment by gruesome Roman crucifixion. However, while that might seem like it ends in tragedy, in fact, it ends in victory because though he's buried in a tomb 3 days later, he rises from the dead physically from the body and appears to his disciples and many other people. And he takes on a kind of new resurrection body. He can walk through walls and, appear and disappear and that sort of a thing. He then ascends into heaven after saying goodbye to his followers and sort of predicts his future coming. He appears, according to Paul, he appears to Paul, the author of much of the New Testament, who has a conversion experience, converts to Christianity from actually persecuting Christians, and actually becomes a missionary to all over the ancient Mediterranean world, in Asia Minor, to spread the good news and to spread Christian churches. And Paul preaches a message in which the end is nigh, essentially. Christ is going to be coming back very shortly. In the book of Thessalonians, he shares a vision or a conception of what will come, where we get the idea of the rapture, which is that Christ will appear in the sky and people will rise up. Those who have died, who are buried, will actually rise up first. So you get the dead bodies kind of coming back to life and going into the sky and meeting Christ there. Um, and so yeah, the remainder of the New Testament consists of letters written by Paul, many written by Paul to various churches navigating the circumstances of early Christian life in the first century A.D., as well as by other disciples, Peter and John and James. And the last book of the New Testament, Revelation, is a divine vision, an apocalyptic divine vision, the end of the world and the coming of Christ, in which the evil are thrown into the pit of fire, and the just, the holy are saved, and there's a new heaven and a new earth created, and everything is fixed after Adam and Eve messed everything up with their sinning. That's sort of the narrative that you get from the New Testament. So picking up the thread of messianic expectation from the Old Testament and through the figure of Jesus, who comes and actually dies, rises again, saves humanity from its sin, ascends into heaven. The end is nigh. That's the story. From the traditional devotional lens. The modern historical critical lens, as with the Old Testament, gives a rather different conception of the New Testament. Again, drawing on the same kinds of resources, source criticism, philology, archaeology. Of course, now we're dealing with a lot better historiography that we can draw from as well. We're not just dealing with ancient Near Eastern and kind of late Bronze Age or Bronze Age collapse kind of stuff. We've got, we've got the whole Roman Empire going on at this period. So there's a lot more sources to triangulate from, which I'll talk about in a second. So a different context in that, and in some ways a bit more robust. But let's just go through it. So what does the modern historical critical lens say? Well, differently than the traditional view, the Gospels actually were not written by eyewitness disciples. The earliest one, Mark, the book of Mark, dates to around 50 years after the death of Jesus, around 50 AD. And is an interesting document, actually, in which, if you read it just kind of on its own terms, Jesus isn't particularly forthright about being the Messiah. This has been called the Messianic secret in Mark, and so a little bit of a different conception of stuff going on there. This source, Mark, the book of Mark, was used as a source by Matthew and Luke to write their Gospels, who also added in other material. And they did that around 80 and 90 or so. I should have prefaced this, by the way. I'm doing all this from memory, so I haven't gone back and like, I don't know the most up-to-date scholarship, like if people are saying, oh yes, it was 84, or or maybe Lucan studies have had a particular shift in thinking, and now they put it at, in the early second century instead of the first. I don't know about that stuff. I'm drawing from what I've internalized through my studies of this. So the last time I was deep into this material would have been probably about 10 years ago, maybe a little less. So there might be developments in the field, but I'm just kind of recounting my understanding of this. So you also have John, which is the fourth gospel, and that's actually he doesn't seem to have used those other sources, but seems to be something rather different. And the latest one, probably early second century AD. And in John, there's no more secret about the messianic thing going on. It's very clear. Most of what Jesus says is, "I am this and I am that," and the theological implications of Jesus's ministry are by that point much clearer in the second century, and a lot more emphatic. Now, where do these names come from? They don't claim to be written by John or by Matthew or Luke. They were ascribed to them through tradition. These gospels were anonymous. They were not written with names attached to them. And so the authorship was ascribed. And so that's important, I think, that these gospels are not eyewitness disciples' accounts of what happened, but actually retroactive historians, in quotes, you could say, piecing together various strands and materials to articulate these narratives with a deeply theological angle as well. Luke probably comes closest to what we would think of as an ancient historian, and I think he kind of self-presents himself that way. But even Luke is no Tacitus per se, or certainly no kind of Thucydides. He's writing a theological work with a theological importance that he's trying to convey, and so these texts need to be understood in those terms. And one of the insights of modern historical critical scholarship is to appreciate genre for its own terms, to not just assume, if you're reading something that is about events happening in time, that this is the same thing as history. So you have to understand that history itself is a category that shows up in history that we can date to, and that texts can be doing similar things without trying to be histories. And that's an important insight. So there's also a very important consensus that's emerged in appreciating Christianity and the New Testament as an outgrowth of Jewish apocalypticism. As I mentioned earlier, the kind of axial age shift and the move towards messianic expectation and the sort of cosmic mapping of these old mythic and theological motifs into sort of absolute terms, and the invention of Satan and the defeat of Satan and this combat that unfolds through this kind of dualistic perspective of good versus evil that will end in the day of judgment, etc. All of that stuff that gets started during that kind of intertestamental period, Christianity is a continuation of. Most people are only familiar with that through the Book of Revelation. It's probably the only apocalyptic literature they've ever read, but in fact, it's much like other apocalyptic literature. Of course, it's in a particularly Christian bent instead of just Jewish, but it carries forward that tradition. And this is important because the entire framing context then of Christianity needs to be understood in that light. Just as it said, sort of like nothing makes sense in biology, outside the light of evolution. Similarly, I think nothing really makes sense about Christianity, or at least origins, the early Christian period, outside the light of apocalypticism. There was the expectation of an imminent end to the world that we see in Paul's message, but that's also in Jesus's message. Jesus is saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near." Jesus's whole good news is that God is going to triumph over the forces of evil, and the end of the world will happen, essentially. And so, viewed in that light, I think the Christian message of good news takes on a slightly different perspective, let's say. Some of this gets filled in a little bit by the work of Josephus, who was an ancient Jewish historian of the time, who gives us a picture of Palestine during this period and in the kind of just leading up to Jesus and kind of revolutionary zealots that were kind of in vogue at the time during the occupation of ancient Palestine by the Romans, and the expectation that this would lead to a kind of holy transformation of the world through a kind of divine intervention once this political war had gotten started. But without getting any of the details, the basic point is that early Christianity is very much an apocalyptic movement. It's expecting the end any day. And in fact, a lot of this explains why most of the texts only show up later, because it's believed that only once the first generation of Christians started dying off that people needed to actually write stuff down. For a long time, it was about, get ready, here it comes. But then when it didn't come, people had to get organized. They had to start developing institutions and churches and bishoprics and hierarchies, et cetera, and writing things down to make sure that the tradition was carried forward. And so you see a transformation occur towards the end of the first century and into the second, from Christianity being a kind of fervent apocalyptic expectation to one that's sort of more in it for the long haul, but still under the expectation that the end was near any day. Uh, um, Now, half of the letters are pseudepigraphic in the New Testament, or roughly half. Many are by Paul. And they're, in fact, some of the earliest Christian, if not the earliest Christian literature there is, sometime around 40. I think he's writing to Galatians, maybe 50 to the Romans. But there are also a lot of pseudo-Pauline works in the New Testament. And there are also pseudepigraphic works attributed to James, Peter, and John. So actually, those disciples didn't write the books of their names either. In fact, in all likelihood, those folks were what they are presented to be in the Gospels, which is illiterate fishermen. So they probably weren't writing Greek theological texts in Asia Minor. And finally, Revelation, is as I said, kind of the most obvious continuation of the apocalyptic tradition, and is sort of representative of that in the best way that can be seen in the New Testament. So, the last thing I guess I'll say about all that is those are largely the findings of so-called historical Jesus studies. Historical Jesus scholarship is a whole kind of field in biblical studies and in New Testament scholarship, something I was into in a big way for a while. And I can recommend books on that if people are interested. But the general consensus is that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, and that was sort of the crux of his idea. That goes all the way back to Albert Schweitzer in the early 20th century, but it's been kind of well documented by Bart Ehrman and Paul Meyer and other folks. And again, the apocalyptic coloration of Christianity in its early years is absolutely, I think, necessary to understand it. Now, all this raises profound implications, right? If we take the historical critical method seriously on its own terms and say, well, what do we make of that? And again, none of this do I see as part of the conversation that I'm witnessing play out in the metamodern, liminal, and beyond sphere. And I think that should change, I guess. This is a consensus of a long period of historical scholarship, and it needs to be taken seriously if we're going to understand these texts. And at the very least, and I'll come back to this in a minute, but we need to be able to toggle to see that these are different perspectives. So what do we make of all this? I mean, there could be attempts to square them, to make them fit with each other, that the traditional and the historical modern are saying the same thing. I don't think that's quite the right approach. I think we do need to do some kind of a triangulation, or that's not quite the right term. because that can lead to conflation. And that's actually a big problem. A lot of people aren't familiar with the differences, even between the different gospels, because they just think they're all telling the same story. When actually, when you line them up and read them individually, there are many discrepancies and contradictions, even just amongst them. What's canonized? The early birth stories of Jesus are a good example. If you compare Luke to Matthew, they're almost entirely different. Mark doesn't even have any of that. So there's actually profound differences in the texts themselves, and people tend to just synthesize them all and conflate them and imagine that those differences aren't there. So triangulation also isn't the right word. Conflation certainly isn't right, and not just in the texts themselves, but in the different perspectives of a traditional devotional approach to a historical critical one. So what do we do? What is the way forward? I personally, as I close this out, would just like to suggest that we take these two lenses seriously, that we don't just pretend that one of them doesn't exist. And if we're going to engage in something like metamodern theology or metamodern Christianity, then we need to take seriously the insights of modern scholarship, modern biblical studies, modern Christian theology. And we can't just shove that under the table and treat the text as though there aren't these very compelling ways of understanding it incredibly differently. So I offer that into the space, and would love to see this conversation carry forward. I'll be talking soon with Paul Vanderklay, and I hope we can get into some of this, the two of us, but I also welcome a broader discourse around Christian theology in metamodernity and what we make of that. Someone like Lena Rachel Anderson, who now talks about polymodernity, might just say, yeah, totally embrace the traditional devotional approach when it comes to religion, but don't do that when it comes to medicine. Well, I think then we have to justify why that's the case, right? If we can subject a text like the Bible to historical critical methods, to kind of standard historiography, and to the methodologies of how the way we treat any kind of literature, to try to date it, to try to see where it comes from, what the different periods or strata are that it evidences. All of that, I think that those are very important, meaningful questions to ask. So trying to justify or rationalize why we wouldn't do that seems a bit like special pleading, only in light of the fact that it yields very different answers than the traditional devotional approach. So I'd love to see some honest engagement with this. I'd love to see some real grappling. And I won't say that it's not hard. It's certainly easier to just take the traditional devotional approach as is, and there's already a flourishing, vibrant Christian community working within that lens to have support from and to have communion with. So there's a lot of reason why it's a difficult thing to try to integrate the insights of the modern historical critical method. But I think it's necessary, at least if we're trying to do anything that would present itself as metamodern. So I think I've made my point, and yeah, I hope this was interesting for people. I guess I'll see by the view count. It'll probably languish somewhere in the low hundreds, maybe. Whereas I expect that it will continue to be the case that making videos about and having conversations with folks who espouse the traditional devotional approach and give people a way to kind of just work within that single lens will continue to be predominantly more popular. And I think the reasons for that are probably clear. And I also don't want to be uncharitable in saying that either. There may be good justifications for that, and if so, I'd love to get into those with those who would like to have this conversation. So I welcome further conversation with would-be metamodern Christian thinkers, theologians, scholars, and practitioners, especially, and I'll close with this, around the idea of not ending in scholarship, but by trying to maintain a robust Christianity in light of the scholarship. I think that's really the puzzle here, and it's not impossible. Many people have done it. Many of the modern Christian scholars have maintained their faiths and deepened their faiths. People like Marcus Borg and others make sense of their religion in a new way after experiencing the insights of engaging with the modern historical critical method. And so there is a path there. And I would say there's even a path beyond it to more interesting and diverse and multi-perspectival ways of engaging the faith. So here's to more conversation. Hope this was helpful for folks. And Godspeed.